So thank you all for joining us and being on time. Today, the focus of this specific lunch and learn is really to start thinking about the behavioral health module. And for this lunch and learn, we're really going to just start thinking about the 6 to 21 version of the CANs. So a little bit about me and a little bit about some of that tech coaching. So my name is Cynthia. I am one of the regional leads for the CANS New York Technical Institute. 4 leads, meaning that each one is designated to really provide some support and technical assistance and trainings at their region. But because we all do the same work, we can always support each other within those specific regions. I am also a training manager for CCF, which is the Children's Health Home. Prior to this, I've had about maybe 5 to 6 years experience, either really training on the CANS tool or really supporting those that are applying this tool into practice. So whether it was in foster care or whether it is now within the health home care management system. So I'm not going to go down through everybody, see who you guys are, but part of that tech coaching is really starting to think about how do you utilize this chat, making sure you guys unmute yourself because we do really want this to be an engaging 1 hour. And the best that I hear what some of those challenges and barriers are, the best I can support you. So if you can just chat in your name, your agency, and your role within that agency, and then I'm just going to move along while you utilize that as to what our learning objectives will look like for this hour. So by the end of this training, participants will be able to do 2 things. So again, we're just focusing on the 6 to 21 version. So we are just going to be speaking in detail and really practicing some of those approaches to rating each item to really start enhancing some fluency, also starting to increase some rating accuracy. And then as we move through this webinar, I really, really want you guys to be engaged. If you could be on video, please be on video. It's hard enough to do this in a virtual platform. So it becomes a little bit more engaging when we're present, when we're here. I will say that, yes, we are recording this webinar, but it's also as a benefit because in the event that you miss something or some of your colleagues miss something, this is going to be posted on our institute as a refresher, as a way to kind of just look back and just make sure that we are really assessing correctly when it comes to this particular module. So if you're not on camera, what's going to happen is that you're going to have your voice appear. And if you're on camera, it's going to be a little box with your picture. So I want you guys to be comfortable and I wanted to be able to share that really quickly. But in that same respect, you know, I want to hear those challenges that we have. I want to hear those barriers that when we are rating this particular module, what are some of those hiccups? And again, the more interaction we have, the more robust, the more meaningful this lunch and learn would be for you and for everyone else that's here, right? Sometimes we tend to be a little bit shy because we don't know how to ask the questions or don't want to ask the questions, and that's understandable. But be open, be free, share your thoughts and share your ideas as we navigate all the items within the behavioral health lunch and learn. The behavioral health module. So moving along, it's really just going to be focusing on the 6 to 21 version. So specifically for that behavioral health module. Now, I just want to remind you guys that this is a module and it's not a core domain. And therefore, not every youth that's on your caseload will have this specific module trigger. If we are doing the CANs, right, and we're thinking about those core domains, then we know that we are rating every youth for that specific core domain. But when it comes to the extension modules, it's a little bit different. So you may or may not be rating this. Some of the items that are here are items like the psychosis, attention concentration, impulsivity, depression, anxiety, oppositional, conduct, emotional control, anger control, as well as attachment. These are actually triggered when we are rating the screening questions. So if we're rating those screening questions for like the behavioral health, the trauma, and we're rating a 1 or 2 or a 3, then it triggers this module for the purposes of a deeper dive, a little more information of what this looks like. So anytime we are utilizing those screening questions and rating them, it's going to jump into kind of this behavioral health module to be able to complete. And the first one we're actually going to go over is this item of psychosis. So psychosis, as we think about it, it's really a clinical term that's used when an individual really loses touch with reality. If we look at the reference guide, because the reference guide does provide item descriptions for every item that you are rating, I would say familiarize yourself with those item definitions and really get to see what it is asking you. So when it comes to psychosis and we're thinking about the reference manual, the way this item is really defined is that psychosis states the key symptoms of which include hallucinations, delusions, and we also want to consider the age, right? And thinking about very bizarre thoughts or behaviors. So we first want to start looking at the first 2 examples that are here. The first one being hearing or seeing things that are not there, which is classified in all as hallucinations. Hallucinations are then defined as a sensory experience in which the person really hears, right? When we're talking about hearing, we're saying the auditory, right? And seeing is that visual, something that's not there. An example of this can simply be that a person that's having auditory hallucination may hear their mom yelling from somewhere, but in fact, their mom is not there. Right? So they conjured up this idea of hearing their mom yelling, but mom is not there, right? If we're thinking about a visual hallucination, an example of that is seeing kind of like faces or animals or even objects that may not even be there. So when we think about hallucinations, this is really exactly what we're looking for. It's auditory as well as visual. When it comes to the delusion sections of the psychosis item, right, this idea of believing things that are not true. When it comes to delusions, these are just beliefs that a person holds despite them being false, even if they can actually be debunked and disproven, right? Delusions can be related to that cognitive impairment. And what I mean by that is that lack of conscious activity or cultural factors. So an example of this particular delusion or what it may look like for a young person is thinking about a young person and they're feeling like they're being followed, feeling like they're tapping into their phone and feeling like someone is watching them and sending them secret messages. That's kind of like an idea of what it looks like for delusions, right? The idea of believing those things that are not true. But there's something that makes it be true for that specific young person. And as you can see on the screen, there are other examples on how someone can be described as struggling with the psychosis symptoms. That can be really about difficulty organizing thoughts or speech, or really or the lack of concentration or feeling, even the lack of suspicion of others, the development on unusual ideas or behaviors, perceptions, having intrusive visions, being able to like see shadows or hearing voices, and change in personality kind of are some examples, not all examples, but some examples as to notable evidence when we are rating psychosis. Now, there is a great resource in order to know more about what psychosis look like and to get other symptoms in regards to this particular item, and that's the National Institute of Health. So here it says that psychosis often begins when a person is in their late teens to mid 20s, right? This is when we start noticing some of these examples, right? But usually what this says is that it starts being present in late teens. And in adolescence, psychosis can be caused by many different circumstances. It varies from substance abuse, from inception of a serious mental health disorder, and above all other things. So if you guys really want to know a little bit about psychosis and what other symptoms are, I am going to drop in this great resource that you guys can really look at and utilize and see for the further explanation of psychosis. And I'm going to pause there because this seems to be an item that sometimes either can be confusing, right, in a young person, and sometimes it can be a little bit confusing if we don't understand it. So I want to pause here and really ask you all, have there been a time or have there been a suspicion of this particular item being surfaced for one of your youth? And if not, do we know now how to really start looking for psychosis within our young people and being able to look at some supporting documentations and being able to have communication around this particular item? And if not, what are some of those items that are difficult to rate? Which ones are a little bit confusing? I'll give you a moment to chat them in. Like I said before, a conversation is worth more than me just going through all these slides. So is there a specific item you're dying for me to get to because it is confusing, you don't understand it, the item description really doesn't define it the way that we think it should look like? And I want to give you guys an opportunity to really share some of those examples, because as we get through these slides, we want to be able to really answer those questions. So despite us having these learning objectives, it's more important for me to know that you guys have a grasp of understanding and a strengthening within this particular module. And I see my video just went out because, as Josh mentioned a little earlier, I am having Zoom problems. So I'll give you a minute to kind of think about some of those items that are there. I'm back on. Anything? What do you hope to gain from this lunch and learn, maybe? That's the question. And I went off camera again. What do you hope to gain from this lunch and learn? Because I really want to keep things moving, but also make sure that I answer the questions. And questions only come as good as I actually receive them. So, you know, we have an hour together. We have an hour on this behavioral health module, which comes into play in many different areas of our work, right? It comes into play for the LLC and for the CAN. So it's important to kind of understand what these items are asking us and making sure that we understand how it affects functioning, right? Because it's two in one. So we can have evidence of this, right? But is it impacting functioning? I don't know what's wrong with this video. Not working. And let me just look at the chat box. I am hoping to gain a better understanding of each section of the behavioral health. The examples are very helpful. All right, great. So I want to again invite you all to stop me, pause me, let me know if I'm talking too fast or if you want further explanation about a certain item, because I do want to take my time with this particular section. The next one we have here is the second one, which is the attention concentration item. If we start thinking about that attention concentration item, right? In the manual, in the reference guide, it actually defines this item as problems with attention, concentration, and task completion would be rated here. So we want to think about attention and concentration as separate, right? These may include symptoms that are part of a diagnosis of ADHD, and it may not, right? Oftentimes it gets confused with the oppositional item. So when we think about some of the behaviors that come with oppositional behavior, we don't really want to capture those here. We want to be able to capture everything aside from anything that would be considered oppositional. So we're going to get into that in a few, but it's important to kind of understand that the attention concentration item and the oppositional item are two separate items, even though they may have some similarities, right? We want to keep them separate and apart. So there is this great resource, which is Kit Sense Child Development, and I'll put that into the chat box because they actually are able to kind of define these two separately. So I'm going to go over that in just a second. I'm just dropping that in right now and really start thinking about attention and concentration separately. When we think about attention, we're thinking about this idea of being able to really obtain and sustain appropriate attention to actually a particular task. Whereas when we think about concentration, we really want to start thinking and referring it to as the ability to focus our attention without a distraction. So here are some of those examples where children may encounter some of those obstacles when we start thinking about attention and concentration. So one of them being difficulty with paying attention in work or play activities. Another one can look like does not listen to when spoken to directly, being unable to finish schoolwork or chores, struggling with organizing tasks and activities, avoiding, disliking, and being just reluctant to parts of the task that really require paying attention. And usually we start seeing this around the schoolwork, around the homework, around chores, right? That dislike, that I don't want to do that right now. Being very reluctant to take part of any type of chores. And of course, we see being easily distracted. So this item is one of those items that may be very familiar to us because when we think about attention and concentration, we're thinking about the ability of focusing, right? And when we think about our young people, sometimes that can be a barrier. So I'm going to pause there and I'm going to ask you all, has there been any child on your caseload in which this item was rated because of these examples that was there? And what did that look like for that young person?
I mean, I've had children who have evidence of this and they go from one topic to another. They can't work on a task that long. Sometimes like it's video games or TV is the one thing that seems to draw them in, but anything where they have to really put some concentration to it, they just can't. And it does make them
have some difficulty.
Yeah. And it does make them reluctant to engage in schoolwork because they just can't sit that long and focus on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that we're able to recognize that, like you, Melody, right? It starts putting this light bulb in. Okay, are we dealing with attention concentration? Because there's a lot of symptoms and a lot of things that actually spill over to other items within the behavioral health module, right? But it's important to kind of really understand what is that item asking me to rate and what does it look like? And I always go back to that idea of action overrides anchor, right? So even though those threes tell us what it can look like, and those twos and those ones and those zeros tell us what it can look like. It's not about really tying your hands, because if we need to take any type of immediate action, we want to be able to do that. So the more we recognize kind of what it looks like and kind of having some examples of evidence can help us rate this particular item and section of the module more accurately, which is what the goal is of this particular Lunch and Learn, right? Looking at what examples look like for each particular item, because sometimes they do spill over. Sometimes it's a little blurred of what it looks like. So thank you for sharing. Anyone else? When they're rating this item, what are we looking for this particular item? Have we ever thought about them being separate? I'll start there. I'll start small and then work myself up. Have we thought about having attention and concentration seen as separate, or do we kind of just combine the two? Right. So I see here, they're separate from Holly. Yeah, let's look at these as two separate things. They do kind of mirror each other in one way or another. But when we're thinking about that, attention and concentrations are things that we look at a little bit differently. Then when we move on to impulsivity, we start thinking about, again, this item description being in the reference guide that really states that problems with impulse control and impulse behaviors, including neurotic disruptions, would be rated here. So when we think about impulsivity, what we're saying and what we're describing is this idea of an act without thinking first. So they're acting about something without really first thinking about it. And typically for that reason, it can be driven by emotions rather than thoughts. So they're not really thinking through this, right? They're emotionally invested in this impulse that they're not thinking through, and they don't have their thoughts together. So they are impulsive. And impulsivity for a young person can really vary from struggling to wait their turn, from really blurting out some answers, and really thinking about school. So young people right now are back in school for the most part. And if we think about a school setting and thinking about impulsivity, we're specifically saying in a classroom, and thinking about a young person or a child who may be engaging in a disruptive manner, or may be intrusive or interrupting others, or someone who's really causing unintentional injury. So when we think about impulsivity, we do want to start thinking about this as the tendency to really act without thinking. And as we go through some of these examples, like tendency to act on the whim, being able to have these behaviors really characterized by little to no forethought, a deflection of some sort, right? Poor judgment, poor decision making, being easily distracted. These are just a few of kind of some notable evidence when we are assessing a child with impulsivity. And I would say that we have examples for each of one of these items, but I always encourage you all, since CANS is a communication tool, we do want to make sure we are collaborating with other service providers and ensuring that we are really being reflective of that child's story in order to have the appropriate services and interventions to address some of these things. So we always going to have some examples. These examples don't fit every child, but these are just some examples that we see that are common. So having temper outbursts, reacting immediately, Unintensely, right? Engaging in risky or antisocial activities. These are just certain things that when we think about impulsivity, this is what it may look like, right? It's not that it will look like this, but it may kind of look like this. Depression is a little bit different, right? Depression is really, if you look at, again, the reference guide, we're really thinking about children in the mode state, where they may be irritable rather than sad, really displaying symptoms of change in emotional state. And that can really include sadness. It can include irritability. It can include a diminish of interest in previously enjoyed activities. So really thinking about these symptoms really has us focus on thinking about how these symptoms can really vary for each youth. So from the emotional state to their behaviors, emotions being frustration, annoyance, loss of interest. Give me some other emotional changes that a youth can have. Chat them in, unmute yourself. What are some of those emotional changes that can occur in a young person or that you've experienced as a worker of that young person? What does that look like when we're thinking about depression and thinking about sadness, crying, tearfulness, hopelessness, isolation? What else comes to mind aside from kind of these examples? I think you really have captured the most common. Yes, I did. Right. And I also want to say that even with emotions, remember there's behavioral because we have the behavioral health module, right? So emotions is just part of it. When we think about those behavioral changes, we're thinking about, a young person who may be feeling fatigue in the event that they may have some depression symptoms, right? A young person that may feel fatigue. They may actually be using some substances, maybe even performing poorly in school, maybe being frequently absent, maybe, carrying out these angry outbursts, right? So although when we think about depression, yes, they are triggered by our emotional state, but what are the behaviors and what are behaviors looking like and what are behaviors changing when it comes to that young person? So again, things to look out for is fatigue. Are they engaging in risky behaviors? Are they doing poorly in school? Are they always angry? Are they argumentative? Are they lashing out? So these are kind of some telltale signs of what it may look like for a young person who may be feeling or going through a depression phase. And then the fifth item here is going to be anxiety. When we're thinking about anxiety, again, the reference guide tells us that it describes worries or fearfulness that interferes with functioning. So anxiety is something that's really broad. So I want to hear from you. What does anxiety look like for you? When you hear or read on a supporting documentation, on a report, on something on progress notes, when you see the word anxiety, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear that? So unmute yourself or just chat it in. I'm feeling anxious just asking you guys about the word anxiety. So what does that look like? I'm also feeling anxious because my video works and it doesn't work. So we have 17 participants, and I went off. My 17 participants, if I say my child is anxious, What is your thought process? What are you thinking? What comes to mind? So I'm seeing a few things in the chat box. Thank you, Josh. I see this often when kids remain focused or can't stop talking about something in their life which they are worried about. Melody, I would say, can you tell me what that looks like for them? And can you tell me a little bit more about your questioning process? Because I do love questioning process. I do love getting to an end point when we're asking a question. Lauren says, I can notice someone hiding anxiety when they're tapping or shaking their legs, right? So there's kind of a little bit telltale signs, right? Either because we as human beings can feel anxious. So, you know, for me personally, I tend to pace, right? If I'm feeling a little bit anxious, I tend to pace a little bit. You know, people tap, people shake their legs, and there's a lot of ways to kind of just think about this anxiety item, right? So anxiety is really about a feeling of fear, a feeling of uneasiness, which really may cause you to kind of sweat, feel restless, maybe even tense up a little bit. You may even have a fast heartbeat, like it is racing so quickly. Michelle writes, biting the nails. Oh, guys, I got you in. Okay, here we go. Fantastic, right? So when it comes to this, it's like that speedy heartbeat, that, oh my God, and really being able to see those reactions, and they're stressful. So you can see this as far as someone being anxious when they're faced with a difficult problem at school, maybe even before taking a test, or maybe even before making an important decision, right? They may have their own thought process. They may feel, you know, uneasy. They may feel restless thinking about, oh my God, how can I overcome this? But when we think about anxiety and we're thinking about the work that we're doing with the young people, we have to think about, is it impacting the youth functioning? Because anxiety is anxiousness, right? That feeling. Many of us as adults can have that feeling. But when we're thinking about the young person, is it impacting that young person's functioning? Right, and we want to start thinking about this item and thinking about each stage of development is different, right? Children have distinct fears and maybe even vulnerabilities, right? So anxiety may look different for kids that are younger versus kids that are older. So younger kids may be anxious about external things. And when I say external things, I'm meaning like maybe monsters in the closet, monsters under the bed, maybe bugs, maybe a fear of the darkness, right? Those are kind of the external things that when we think about anxiety, more than likely the younger kids may experience this. When we're thinking about the older children, maybe their display of anxious behavior is really about thinking about themselves and viewing themselves. So are they good at a sport? Changes in their body, right? As they grow up, their body starts to change. Maybe they're anxious. Maybe, you know, they're not developing as quickly as maybe their peers. So now they're like reserved. Maybe they're not achieving as much as their peers, right? So it does look different for our younger folks than it does for our older folks. So here are some of those examples here, right? That fear, that worrying, that feeling on edge, that fatigueness, being irritable, avoiding difficult situations, right? That idea of like, I don't want to see it, I'm anxious, and I'd rather just skip this whole thing because I don't want to fail. And withdrawing from social activities. So I'm going to pause right there. We went over 5 of those items. And before I get into our little practice vignette, which would take no more than 2 seconds to complete, I just want to make sure that we are understanding those 5 items. And if you have questions, this is going to be that opportunity to ask them before I move on. Okay. So here we have a mini vignette, and this vignette is going to be focused on Amori. So it's going to be engaging. I really want us to start thinking about the practice and how we're going to identify some of the items we just reviewed in the behavioral health module and really see what we have evidence for and being able to rate it here. So I'll read it out to you. Amori is a 16-year-old boy who is in the 10th grade. Amori was doing well in school up to a few months ago when his best friend transferred to a new school. His teacher, Ms. Rivera, reports he has lost focus and is failing behind on a lot of schoolwork. Amori states that he feels alone. He worries that it's too late to make new friends and has begun to isolate himself at school and at home. His parents worry because recently Amori expressed to them how happy he was to have a new friend. When asked about the new friend, he responded, "Only I can see him or hear him." Caregivers expressed their concerns to the school counselor and the care manager because Amori stated his new friend has encouraged him to hurt himself. So thinking about the first 5 items, which ones would be actionable and how would we rate them? So I'll give you a moment to chat them in or unmute yourself. Which items that are listed right here would you take action for? Sarah writes in psychosis. Absolutely, that's something we definitely want to take a look at because it will be actionable. Yes, Monica, absolutely. We want to look at psychosis. That may be an item that is actionable here. What other items can be classified as actionable? Attention concentration would be actionable. Yes. I saw depression with a question mark by Sarah and then Mallory, writing it in. Okay. We'll talk about that in when we're thinking about the depression, right? Rating it a 1 with this lens of we want to keep an eye on it because when we have these fictional mini vignettes, we really want to look at the evidence that we have here and take it literally. So you guys are absolutely correct in having that inkling of, I want to start looking at depression. Absolutely correct. We have a consensus of 1. However, this is the opportunity to have those conversations with the caregiver, right? If we're feeling like, action, not action, this is the perfect opportunity where we should start collaborating with our service providers, with, the family, just to make sure that we are capturing that child's story, in this case, Amori. So great. What else can we see action for? Can we see action for anxiety? And if so, what was that evidence that you see here that can get you there? If this was a child on your caseload and you have this little vignette, would you rate anxiety as actionable or not? Yes or no? I'm saying a yes. Yeah, we really want to take some action around this anxiety, right? Maybe a 1, Sarah says, okay, right? But it's on our radar, right? It's there. We want to make sure that we are having these conversations with that young person. So before we get into the next 5 items, are there any questions thoughts, ideas, or suggestions when it comes to the first 5 items that we just went over? And if not, I know we have 15 minutes, so I will speak as quickly as possible. But again, I think your conversation, your input, your knowledge, your experience, your challenges are worth more of a conversation than going one by one. So again, always feel free to speak up when we get to something that you want a little bit more explanation on. Okay. So here we are with oppositional. I did mention a little bit earlier that we are going to be discussing it, so here we are. So oppositional is our 6th item on the behavioral health module. And again, just like every other item, it is defined by the reference guide as being defiance or non-compliance with authority figures. In short, it just basically means that there are some defiant behaviors that are being presented, or maybe some outbursts that are being presented that is directly towards people of authority. This can include a child that is really argumentative, a child who may be, vindictive, or maybe even spiteful towards adults and authority. And when we think about those types of behavior, we know that they do tend to cause some type of disruption in their normal daily activities, whether it's at home, whether it's with the family, whether it's with school, or with the community. There is some type of disruption. So there are 3 behaviors that are really, really typically associated when it comes to oppositional behavior. Those are outlined here as being, a youth who may exhibit behavior that is argumentative with an adult, with an authoritative figure, being non-compliant of rules that are really set in place by either the adult, meaning the caregiver or whomever that young person is with, or any type of authority figure, right, like a police officer or anybody else, that they may start presenting kind of this angry, irritable display of emotion because they're kind of annoyed by them, right? They have this real defiant behavior towards them. So again, some of those examples can include blaming others for maybe their own mistakes, maybe blaming others maybe for their unwillingness to kind of compromise, being angry or resentful, having those patterns of negativity, hostility, and defiance. So when we're thinking about oppositional, it's really about their defiant behavior towards authority or people of authority. So that can look many different ways depending on that specific young person. And then we have conduct. When we're thinking about conduct, again, the reference guide shows that as antisocial behaviors. So in other words, youth who do not really follow societal rules or socially acceptable norms would be classified here as being able to rate their conduct. So young people demonstrating behaviors that are consistent with, this item that may be kind of breaking some rules, may lack some empathy for other behaviors, even thinking about the juvenile delinquent behaviors that they may display, because again, if we're thinking about conduct, we're thinking about these rule-breaking behaviors. And if we think about rule-breaking behaviors, more often than not, they kind of sometimes get associated with the juvenile justice system. So there may be times where a young person does have a conduct problem, and it may be that that young person can be faced with some juvenile justice system, right? So however those behaviors are present or persistent, or part of a pattern, is something we want to capture here. So again, we're looking at behaviors that are very persistent for that young person and created a pattern for that young person. We want to be able to capture that here. So kind of some of those examples is stealing, skipping school, harming animals, bullying, destroying property, consistent lying, lack of empathy and and remorse, starting fights or violence, being physically um, physically fighting and things of that nature is what we think about when we think about the conduct item. If we start thinking about now the emotional control, we start thinking about this ability to really manage emotions in order to achieve goals, solve problems, and also make effective decisions. So the manual does reference affect dysregulation. So when we're thinking about affect dysregulation, it's really about the ability to express or control appropriate emotions. So emotional control is really about this idea of managing fluctuations and either in their mood or maybe in their experience, maybe in their disruptive emotions, and seeing that youth may exhibit emotions that are not really consistent with a certain situation. So they may be somewhere, they're fine, something they remember or see can trigger an emotion, and all of a sudden, this young person went from happy to sad, right? Because there was something there that emotionally contributed to sad or happy. So it can go either way. The inability to really regulate our emotions really is impactful. And we should start rating this as actionable. So when a young person has a hard time controlling their emotions, then we want to start thinking about how is that impacting their functioning. If it's impacting their functioning, then we do want to start looking at those twos and those threes when it comes to this specific item. So again, some of those examples can look like having a difficulty calming down when upset, a hard time decreasing some negative emotion, becoming avoidant or even aggressive when dealing with any type of negative emotion. Any questions so far? I am trying to cover a lot in a short period of time, but I do not want to ignore my audience. I want to just pause there to make sure that I still have you, that we are present, and that you guys are following along and I'm not losing you. Because we're going to move on to anger control, which at times kind of mirrors a little bit about, kind of the emotions. Sometimes they go hand in hand sometimes. Sometimes they may be associated with each other. And we really want to just kind of distinguish the two, kind of like we did for attention and concentration. So kind of like that emotional control item, there are going to be difficulties when youth are faced with anger. I think we all can relate to this anger control, right? But when it's a young person and they don't really know how to channel it or they don't really know how to compartmentalize their anger, it can really lead again to some disruptions for that young person. Those disruptions can be from the family, from home, from school, and from the community. While maybe there have other maybe adults that kind of just yes them, right? So what I'm trying to say is that if you're a caregiver or an adult and you recognize that the young person gets angered easily or throws tantrums or they're able to be controlled when they're in a state of anger, that the caregiver will really just kind of adapt or kind of just adjust to those emotions because they don't want to trigger that young person. So they tend to just stay away. They tend to just reduce that anger response from them so that way they are not being explosive. So what that can look like is someone being unable to control their anger or emotional outbursts, right? Maybe it takes them a little while to kind of be able to communicate or wind down, to be able to understand kind of what it is that you're asking of them. And then the last piece of the entire thing is this idea of attachment. So when we're thinking about attachment, it's just like every other item, and we want to look at that reference guide and really look at that specific item, which describes the child's ability to form relationship with significant caregivers in an age-appropriate way. So assessing for attachment will actually require to really look at that young person's significant relationships. This may be with their caregiver, or it may be with other people who they may have some long-standing relationship with or some personal relationship with. Much of really what we know about attachment these days is really about learning that process. And there is this British psychologist, John Bowlby, who's really kind of put these into three separate categories. So the first type of attachment we want to think about is the anxious avoidant attachment. And this attachment can best be described as kind of this mistrust towards the parent or the caregiver, and having this feeling of insecurity that really requires that caregiver or that parent to have their approval, that continuous approval. The other type of attachment we tend to look at is avoidance. When we're thinking about that avoidant attachment, it's really about that acceptance of feelings, that unloved and feeling unimportant. And sometimes that may be hard for the young person to be able to express and even understand for themselves. And then the last one is disorganized. So oftentimes this one is described as a maladaptive strategy that is really inconsistent or may fluctuate between avoidant and anxious attachment. So it may have a combination of the two that I just mentioned, which kind of creates maybe some challenges for that young person to actually form some type of relationship, whether that's close relationships, whether that's personal relationships, from their childhood all the way through adulthood. And what that can look like for a young person is that lack of physical affection, inappropriate cleanliness, right? The lack of fear of strangers, randomly seeking affection from other people, right? Kind of having inappropriate type of attachments that are sometimes classified as not healthy. And then we're going to have an activity, and we're going to squeeze this in 2 minutes as we near towards the end of this specific lunch and learn. So I'll try to read this really quickly. If you guys have any questions, again, just chat them in. But I want to get through this particular activity thinking about the last 5 items we just went over. So here we have Amia. She is 16 years old. She is currently residing with her grandmother following a physical altercation with her mother. Amia has always been known to run away as a way to get away. She is the oldest of 5 siblings and has been given most of the responsibility of parenting her younger siblings. She recently dropped out of school, has been arrested twice due to insubordination with authority figures, and has had a hard time understanding why everyone is picking on her, even when she is trying to live her life. Amaya can be very argumentative and is known as the neighborhood bully. So thinking about the last 5 items, right, F through J, which ones are we rating as actionable here? Are there any items here that would be rated as actionable? Thinking about the first item, oppositional, will we rate that for action, yes or no? So I'm seeing oppositional, I'm seeing conduct. How about emotional control and anger control? Are those 2 items something that is actionable for Amia? So when we're thinking about these 5 items, we want to look at that emotional control and anger control item, right? There is evidence in this little mini vignette that suggests that Amia has a hard time being able to control either her emotions and or her anger. Yes, I see Molly chatted in oppositional anger control, perhaps, and she's a bully. Yes, absolutely, right? But here we can see there's no evidence in regards to the attachment item, right? So I want to make sure that you guys have no questions as I kind of just share with you who we are as an institute. So, each person, as I said before, is broken down into different regions. So here is our email. Feel free to kind of follow up with us. If you have any lingering questions from this specific luncheon, and just reach out to us. But I also wanted to provide the summary of references and resources. So yes, I will email these slides to everybody. So that way, I think it's also important for you guys to have that summary of reference in case you guys want to read it on your own and kind of just see what other symptoms may look like when you are working with your young people. So that concludes today's webinar. I got it in at 1 o'clock. Thank you all. I do want to draw your attention really quickly to our new email address. So we do have this email address where you can actually email us and we will be very responsive in responding to you. So take advantage of this, and here are some other things where you can find us and get some resources. I am going to drop in our Lunch and Learn evaluation, and this will help us know what are some of those challenges and really provide us the feedback that will be helpful in the future when we are doing these Lunch and Learns again. So thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure for having you here during this time.